she entered the war without a name, without an identity, without the right to exist as a soldier, hidden beneath a man's uniform, armed only with courage and a rifle. She would become a legend, unrecorded in the history books. This is the forbidden story of the woman who fooled entire armies and changed the course of the war. World War I is remembered for its muddy trenches, the incessant noise of artillery, and the birth of a new industrialized world. A world where even cigarettes, as we saw earlier, became a cultural weapon of control. But there are stories that have been buried under the same mud of the trenches. Stories that official records tried to erase because they challenged the order of the time. Among them, the almost forgotten accounts of women who dared to fight disguised as men. At the beginning of the conflict, thousands of women volunteered to fight. The general's response was clear: there is no place for you in the ranks. The role of women was restricted. Nurses, Red Cross volunteers, messengers, cooks, always close to the line of fire, but never allowed to hold a rifle. However, in the midst of the conflict, some refused this fate. They preferred lies to silence, and they forged male identities to cross the border of prohibition. Our protagonist is not a mythical invention. Her name here is Elisabeth Krüger, a fictional name inspired by fragments of real accounts preserved in diaries, letters, and soldiers' testimonies. She represents the dozens of women whose stories have been erased from official memory. Elisabeth was born in Germany. She grew up listening to the same nationalist speeches that inflamed the boys of her generation. But she knew she would never be called to the front lines. Her gender was a prison. When war broke out in 1914, her father was drafted, her older brother, too. Months later, both were dead. The country cried out for more soldiers, but would not accept soldiers like her. That was when Elisabeth made her decision. On a quiet night, she stole the uniform of a fallen young man, a boy from her village who had not survived the training. She cut her hair in front of the broken mirror at home. She bound her chest with improvised bandages, and the next morning, she introduced herself as Erich Krüger, a new recruit, ready to serve. The cruel detail: the army, overwhelmed by demand, didn't ask many questions. Forged papers, a simple name, and the charade was set. The same system that had banned women, paradoxically, made room for one of them to infiltrate. The arrival at the trenches was brutal. The bitter cold, mud up to the knees, the constant smell of gunpowder mixed with that of decomposing bodies. And the cigarettes, just as before, the trenches were enveloped in constant smoke, not just from the bombs, but from the tobacco pouches distributed by the state as fuel for morale. Elisabeth, now Erich, learned to smoke, not for pleasure, but to belong. Refusing a cigarette was refusing a gesture of camaraderie, and she couldn't afford to raise suspicion. At first, Elisabeth kept quiet. She was smaller than the others, more reserved, an easy target for suspicion. But the first patrol changed everything. When the enemy ambush took the group by surprise, it was Erich who kept his cool. With unlikely precision for a recruit, he fired 2 shots that saved the platoon. From that day on, the looks changed. She was no longer just the strange recruit. She was the soldier who knew how to shoot. And ironically, the more he stood out, the greater the risk of being discovered. Elisabeth lived between 2 worlds. In the cold, in hunger, in fear, she shared the same fate as her comrades. But in the silence of the nights, when the frozen mud was her only shelter, she carried the weight of a secret that could cost her her life. If she were caught, she would not just be expelled, she would be accused of treason. And in times of war, treason meant summary execution. Execution was always lurking. However, Elisabeth did not give up. On the contrary, with each day she survived, with each battle she grew stronger. And little by little, she began to form bonds that would defy not only the rules of the army, but also destiny itself. Because in the trenches, amidst the cigarette smoke and the echo of explosions, a legend was born. The legend of the ghost woman of war. And no one knew that behind the mask of Soldier Erich, there was a woman fighting not only against the enemy, but against time, against fear, and against the very world that denied her existence. She did not seek glory, nor did she want her name on monuments. She just wanted to be there, where few believed a woman could be. And while the cannons roared, and the sky shattered into pieces, she carried not only her rifle, but the weight of a secret that united her and isolated her at the same time. In the eyes of her comrades, she saw trust. In her own mind, she felt the constant terror of a slip, a voice too loud, a hesitant movement, a long-avoided shower, and it would all be over. But still, she continued. She did sentry duty, helped dig new trenches, shared the last sip of brandy,
and listened to the stories of others about distant homes, girlfriends waiting, children they had never seen. And she pretended to have one too, a fiancé in Berlin who wrote letters that never arrived, another lie, to sustain the biggest one, until on a night of light snow, something changed. A new recruit arrived at the platoon, young, wounded, but with a sharp gaze. And when he looked at Erich, he didn't just see a soldier, he saw something different, and he said nothing, but his eyes remained. And since then, Elisabeth felt that she was no longer the only one keeping the secret. Someone knew, or suspected, and that was worse than any shooting. Because in wars, often, the danger does not come from the enemy front, it comes from within, from the silence, from a pair of eyes in the dark. And so, between restrained breaths, calculated gestures, and accurate shots, the ghost woman continued to exist. Not officially, not legally, but real, more real than many heroes written in books. And when the war finally ended, and the survivors returned home, no one asked about Erich Krüger. He simply disappeared, as if he had never existed. But those who saw him shoot, those he saved in that ambush, those who shared bread with him in the mud, never forgot. And in taverns years later, in hushed voices, stories were told about a strange soldier, fast, silent, who seemed to appear out of nowhere and disappear with the morning mist. They called him der Geist, the ghost, but some whispered that he was not a man, and that perhaps the true strength of that war did not come from factories or tanks, but from a woman who chose to fight even when the world said she couldn't. And perhaps that is the most important story of all, not about how to win a war, but about how to maintain humanity when everything tries to erase it.
Over time, Erich Krüger ceased to be just the new recruit. His silence, once seen as weakness, became an enigma. In the eyes of others, that young man reserved his energy for what really mattered: survival. And surviving meant obeying the ritual of the trenches, marching, digging, enduring the mud, eating moldy bread, drinking muddy water, and above all, smoking. Cigarettes were still the invisible glue. During breaks, when hell took a pause, each soldier lit one up. The smoke mixed with the fog of the field, creating a temporary brotherhood. Elisabeth learned to cough less, to swallow slowly, until the mask was perfect. It was almost poetic. The same smoke that hid her secret also hid the emptiness that consumed an entire generation. Elisabeth didn't just adapt, she shone. Her talent with the rifle caught the attention of the officers. In a world where life was measured in seconds, her coolness in combat saved dozens. One accurate shot, another even faster, and soon the name Krüger was circulating among the battalions. There were those who believed he had a pact with death, others said he felt no fear at all. But the truth was much crueler. Elisabeth couldn't feel fear like the others, because fear was already part of her secret identity. Among her comrades, a bond began to stand out. Hans Adler, a robust soldier, known for his insane courage to advance in suicide attacks. In the silence of the nights between shared cigarettes and whispered conversations, Hans and Erich developed something rare in that place: trust. Hans talked about his village, the fiancée he had left behind, his desire to one day open a bakery. And Elisabeth, hidden beneath her disguise, listened. At times, she let small gestures slip, a lingering glance, a hand that lingered when passing a canteen. Hans noticed, and somewhere inside him, perhaps he knew there was something different about that boy. But in the midst of war, suspicions became dangerous luxuries. The first signs appeared in almost invisible details: the way Erich avoided communal baths, the way his hands, too delicate for life in the field, held the rifle with almost rehearsed perfection, or how, in moments of silence, his voice let slip a tone too soft for the profile of a hardened soldier. War sharpens the senses, and soon, some began to whisper, a rumor here, another there, nothing concrete, but enough for Elisabeth to feel the weight of their stares on her. It was in 1916 that the charade almost fell apart. During the Verdun offensive, one of the bloodiest in history, Elisabeth and her platoon were thrown to the front. Explosions tore through the sky, mud mixed with fresh blood, and smoke covered everything like a veil of death. Amid the chaos, a surprise French attack nearly wiped out the troop. Hans was shot in the leg. Without thinking, Elisabeth ran to him. She carried him on her shoulders, under crossfire, until she dragged him back to the trench. The scene did not go unnoticed. The strength she showed seemed impossible for her physical build, and when Hans, wounded, looked into her eyes, something shone there, not just gratitude, but recognition, as if at that moment he had seen someone beyond the uniform. Hans survived,
but spent weeks recovering. During that time, Elisabeth remained by his side. They spoke little, but the silence said it all. She knew that any slip could reveal her identity, and at the same time, she knew she was becoming more and more attached to him, bound by a secret, by a war, by a destiny that did not allow love. It was there that the legend of the ghost woman began to take shape, not only because of her courage on the battlefield, but because of the mystery of her existence. But the rumors grew. One soldier swore he had heard her voice change during the night. Another claimed to have seen her softer features in the light of an explosion. The officers began to suspect, and in the army, suspicion was synonymous with death. Elisabeth lived in constant tension, every gesture measured, every word calculated. The fear was not only of the enemy, but of her own comrades, and yet, the war did not stop, death did not wait, and each battle was another opportunity to hide or reveal her truth. Thus, amid the cigarette smoke and blood spilled on the mud, Elisabeth Krüger grew as a soldier, as a myth, as a ghost, respected, feared, suspected, silently loved by a man who perhaps already knew the truth. But in war, secrets do not remain buried forever, and each shot from her rifle brought her closer, not only to glory, but also to ruin.
As the war dragged on, the numbers piled up. Dead, missing, wounded, but also heroic deeds. And among the German soldiers, one name was whispered more and more: Krüger, the relentless marksman, the man who never missed, the soldier who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Elisabeth didn't just adapt. She shaped the battlefield. Her shots turned offensives into retreats, ambushes into victories. There was something almost supernatural about her coldness, and it began to inspire both admiration and fear. In war, today's hero can be tomorrow's suspect. The more her reputation grew, the more she was called upon for impossible missions, targets miles away, covering the advances of entire troops, and sometimes firing shots in absolute silence, without anyone ever knowing where the bullet had come from. With each victory, the army profited from her presence. But each successful mission also increased the risk of exposure, because the more time passed, the closer Elisabeth became to the others, and intimacy, in times of war, was almost as dangerous as the enemy. Hans, recovered from his injuries, returned to the front. Alongside Elisabeth, they became an inseparable duo. He, the fearless soldier of hand-to-hand combat; she, the silent sniper, the shadow that covered him from a distance. But there was something different in Hans's eyes now, not just trench camaraderie. It was something deeper, more unsettling. And on some nights, when the cigarette smoke dissolved in the wind, Hans would stare at her, as if he were about to speak, but he never did. Elisabeth feared these pauses as much as she feared enemy bullets, for she suspected, perhaps Hans already knew, it was during a rainy morning that the danger took real shape. The command ordered a surprise inspection, collective bathing, changing clothes, medical examination. It was the routine that all soldiers hated, but they complied without hesitation. For Elisabeth, it would be the end. As the troops marched toward the tent, she looked for a way out. Her heart beat like artillery drums. Any slip, any detail revealed, and the charade would be over. And it was Hans who discreetly stood by her side. He whispered softly, almost imperceptibly, "Let me distract the sergeant." And somehow, he succeeded. A deliberate commotion, a harsh comment, and in the midst of the chaos, Elisabeth escaped with a superficial examination. For the first time, she was sure. Hans knew, but he had chosen to protect her secret. However, war leaves no time for feelings. That same week, the order came for a brutal offensive. The German army needed to cross a line of French machine guns installed on a hill that seemed impregnable. The mission was suicidal, and there was only one chance that Krüger would eliminate the gunners, one by one, before the platoon was reduced to dust. Elisabeth accepted. She positioned herself silently, in the cold mud, with her rifle steady in her hands. And as always, she fired with deadly accuracy. With each shot, a body fell. With each shot, an advance was possible. The hill, once a wall of fire, began to crumble under her relentless aim. But on that day, fate decided to take its toll. Amid the chaos, an enemy shot ricocheted near her position. The impact did not hit her directly, but tore part of her uniform. The fall was brutal, and in her rush to recover, part of her underwear was exposed in the mud. Hans, rushing to protect her, saw it, and maybe someone else did too,
but no one said anything at the time, because in that moment, all they could see was the victory Krüger had given them. Still, the silence after the battle was different. Prolonged stares, conversations interrupted when she passed by, an invisible weight began to surround her, and that was precisely where the legend was born. Some soldiers began to spread stories. They said that Krüger was not human, that he was a spectre, a ghost who had taken the form of a soldier to lead the Germans to victory. Others swore that he was in fact a woman, an envoy of forgotten gods, condemned to fight in disguise among men until the end of the war. The versions multiplied, but the truth, no one dared to confirm it, because to confirm it would mean challenging one of the most lethal soldiers on the front. So, between victories and mistrust, Elisabeth became greater than herself. From a hidden soldier, she became a living myth, a ghost who inspired courage, and at the same time, aroused fear. But the siege was closing in, and no matter how much Hans protected her, no matter how much the legend grew, there was something inevitable. Secrets do not survive forever in times of war.
The trenches weren't just mud and gunpowder, they were also the stage for rumors. Every glance directed at Elisabeth seemed to carry an unspoken question. Soldier Krüger was no longer seen as just a hero, he was seen as an enigma. Some soldiers spoke of gratitude, others, in a darker tone, of mistrust. Because in war, secrets weren't just strange, they were threats. And threats, sooner or later, were eliminated. Hans said nothing, but his actions spoke volumes. He always found a way to be around, to cover up small mistakes, to silence suspicion with a timely joke, to keep everyone's eyes away from her. It was more than protection, it was complicity. And Elisabeth knew it. On a moonless night, after a particularly brutal mission, the two found themselves alone. Hans's hands were shaking, not because of the war, but because of the weight of everything he knew. He approached her, and for the first time broke the silence. "I know who you are, but I won't tell anyone." Elisabeth froze, a second of fear, of calculation, of wondering whether she should run away, deny it, or even kill him. But Hans just smiled, exhausted. "You are the reason we are still alive. For me, that's enough." It was the first time, in months of hell, that Elisabeth let a tear fall. And there, between blood and mud, something impossible was born. A love condemned by war. Their relationship grew like a flame hidden in the dark. Minimal gestures, lingering glances, whispered words. In front of others, they were inseparable comrades. But in the solitude of silent nights, they were more than that. It was a forbidden love, not only because it defied the rules of the army, but because any revelation could mean Elisabeth's immediate execution. Still, that bond gave them both strength. While Hans threw himself into open battle, Elisabeth fired from above, knowing that every shot was, deep down, to keep him alive. But it also brought with it a new danger. The closer they became, the harder it was to keep the secret intact. Then came the order that would change everything, Verdun, the name that would become synonymous with massacre. Elisabeth was assigned to lead a strategic position, providing cover for hundreds of soldiers for days on end. No rest, no time to think. Just shoot, reload, shoot again. The deaths piled up before her eyes, and each fallen body was another weight on her conscience. There, she realized she was no longer fighting just as a soldier. She was fighting as a ghost, condemned to never rest. Hans, always by her side, began to show signs of change. The brutality of war consumed him, and Elisabeth feared that the line between survival and insanity would break at any moment. Amidst this chaos, a new sergeant took command of the company. A rigid man, suspicious, who seemed to take pleasure in exposing the soldiers to humiliation. And it was he who began to investigate Krüger. He questioned his accuracy. He noted strange details in reports, and he spread doubt among the men. Hans sensed the threat, but he couldn't confront him openly. Elisabeth, for her part, felt the net closing in. Each mission was now not only against the enemy, but against the very army she was supposed to call her ally. One night, after a particularly bloody battle, Elisabeth and Hans were trapped alone in a destroyed shelter. The silence was heavy, broken only by their heavy breathing. It was there that, without thinking, Hans kissed her, a quick, desperate, almost violent gesture, as if he were afraid he would never have another chance. Elisabeth responded, not because she believed in the future, but because that night she needed to remember that she was still human. But fate does not forgive mistakes. Outside, a shadow watched, one of the soldiers. No one said anything at that moment, but the rumors would intensify from then on. From that point on, each day became more unbearable. Elisabeth knew that the army would not accept her secret.
Hans knew that he could not protect her forever, and both understood a cruel truth. In war, forbidden love does not last. While Verdun burned men, Elisabeth burned inside, torn between her mission and her desire to survive alongside Hans. The ghost she had created for herself was no longer just a disguise, it was her prison. So, in Verdun, Elisabeth discovered what it was like to fight on two fronts at the same time, against the enemies that surrounded her, and against the secret that threatened to destroy her from the inside out. Her forbidden love with Hans gave her strength, but it also condemned her, because on the battlefield, the heart was as dangerous as any bullet.
War was made up of blind orders and absolute obedience. And for the new sergeant, Krüger was a piece that didn't fit. He observed too much, he questioned too much, he killed with too much precision. In his mind, there was no room for heroes, only for traitors in disguise. And so, each mission became a silent test. He put Elisabeth in impossible positions, as if he expected her to fail. But she never failed. And that, paradoxically, only increased his suspicion. Among the soldiers, the ghost soldier was no longer just a comrade, he was a myth in the flesh. Some believed that Krüger was an envoy of fate, protected by the gods of war. Others whispered that there was something wrong with him, that he was no ordinary man, perhaps not even human. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said that Krüger never slept, others that his eyes glowed in the dark. There were even those who swore that bullets deflected off him. With each victory, Elisabeth found herself more imprisoned by the character she had created, and less able to be who she really was. Hans watched all this with anguish. He knew the truth. He knew that behind the myth, there was just a brave woman, trying to survive. But he also knew that the higher Elisabeth rose in the soldier's admiration, the deeper the abyss of her fall would be, if she were discovered. The forbidden love between them, once a refuge, began to weigh heavily. Hans could no longer hide his jealousy from the looks directed at her. And Elisabeth feared that this jealousy would lead him to make a fatal mistake. In a sharp whisper, she said to him one night, "If you love me so much, you will hate me even more when you find out." Hans clenched his jaw. "Then you'll never let them find out." But even he didn't believe his own words. The sergeant wouldn't give up. He summoned Krüger for interrogations disguised as conversations. He analyzed his posture, his voice, even the way he shaved. Once, he even locked Elisabeth alone in a room, just to observe her reaction to the suffocating silence. She kept up her mask, but her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to echo off the walls. It was at that moment that Elisabeth realized an even more dangerous truth. It wasn't enough to be a good soldier. She had to be a perfect man, all the time. Any slip, any detail, could cost her her life. On a starless dawn, the troops were surprised by an enemy ambush. Bombs fell like thunder, and the trenches turned into tunnels of despair. The sergeant, who until then had seemed untouchable, was hit by shrapnel and fell, screaming for help. And there, faced with a cruel choice, Elisabeth hesitated: save the man who threatened her life, or let him die, and perhaps free herself forever. Hans looked at her, waiting for her decision. Time stood still, and Elisabeth, against all instinct for self-preservation, ran to pull him out of the mud, dragging him to a safe shelter. He would live, and with him, his deadly distrust. This act of courage turned the myth into legend. The soldiers now firmly believed that Krüger could not die. They called him der Geist, the ghost. They said that war would never take him, that death itself bowed before him. But for Elisabeth, that was not glory, it was condemnation. The more mystical his figure became, the more impossible it would be to ever regain her true identity. It was as if she were disappearing into the character itself. The woman she had been no longer existed. Only the ghost remained. Hans couldn't take it anymore. The love that had been born as a flame now burned with rage. Rage at the war, at the secret, and at the role that forced Elisabeth to live. One night, he exploded in despair. "They idolize you as if you were a god. But to me you're just a woman, the woman I love. How long are you going to hide?" Elisabeth, with tears in her eyes, replied, "Until the last day, because if they find out, it won't be me who dies. It will be both of us." The silence that followed was more devastating than any bomb. There, they both understood that the love that united them also destroyed them. In that war, Elisabeth was no longer fighting only against enemies. She was fighting against time, against the sergeant, against rumors, and even against her own heart. The myth of the phantom grew, but behind it, the woman was increasingly lost, and on the bloody horizon of Verdun, only one truth remained clear: secrets never survive war. Winter fell upon the front like a sentence, snow mixed with blood, and each breath felt like a blade piercing the lungs. On that forgotten front, the enemies were preparing a massive attack. It would be the ultimate test for everyone, and also for Elisabeth. The sergeant, his body still marked by shrapnel, watched Krüger like a hunter waiting for his prey to make a fatal move. He was certain, in that battle, the mask would fall. The troops received orders to advance through a devastated no-man's land, under a hail of machine gun fire. Few expected to return. Hans, overcome with fear of losing Elisabeth, begged, "Run away with me, now, before it's too late." She looked around, exhausted men, frozen bodies, empty eyes. "I can't. If I run away, they will all die." Hans held her hand for a moment, as if trying to hold on to that love in the real world, but he let go. He knew there was no turning back. The attack began. Explosions tore through the grey sky, soldiers fell one by one, swallowed by mud and fire. Elisabeth advanced, machine gun in hand, shouting orders that seemed to come from a superhuman being, and that was what the troops saw, a god of war incarnate in fragile flesh. But then, in the midst of the onslaught, a piece of shrapnel tore through her uniform. The fabric gave way, and for a moment everyone saw the curve of a body that was not a man's, the truth exposed in the glare of death. The sergeant's eyes widened, Hans shouted her name, and the silence of revelation seemed louder than all the bombs. There was a second of disbelief, a second in which Elisabeth ceased to be Krüger, ceased to be a ghost, ceased to be a soldier. She was just a woman standing before a troop of broken men, but at that very moment, she raised her weapon and opened fire on the enemy machine gun, clearing the way for her comrades to advance. The shock of the revelation turned into a wave of collective fury. It no longer mattered whether one was a man or a woman. All that mattered was survival, and they survived because she did not hesitate. At the end of the battle, the field was covered with dead bodies. Blood stained the snow like a scarlet sheet. Elisabeth fell among the bodies, exhausted, her uniform torn, her identity exposed. The sergeant approached, weapon in hand, ready to silence the scandal. But before he could act, the soldiers themselves stood between him and Elisabeth. Men who had once distrusted her, now protected her as if she were sacred. "She saved us. Without her, we would all be dead." The words echoed like a sentence. The sergeant backed away, powerless in the face of the devotion she inspired. Hans knelt beside her, holding her bloodied hand. His face was covered in mud and tears. "You're not a ghost, you're the most real person I've ever met." Elisabeth smiled, a smile broken by pain. "Then let me die like one." Hans cried, but he knew it was true. If she survived, she would be hunted, humiliated, erased from history, died in silence, not as a soldier, but as a fraud. In that field, among the ruins, Elisabeth chose her end. She died as she had lived, in the uniform she had stolen, with the lie that had become truth, with the weight of impossible love in her eyes. The survivors never forgot. In the official reports, Krüger died a hero. No mention was made of her true identity. But among the soldiers, a story circulated, quietly, in the cold barracks, that of the ghost who walked among them, neither man nor woman, just a spirit of war. And so, Elisabeth ceased to exist. In her place, der Geist, the ghost, was born. A name whispered in trenches, told in taverns, lost among legends that no one ever dared to write in the history books. In war, secrets never survive. But some become something greater than the truth. Elisabeth Krüger did not enter the official records, but her legend has lingered for decades, like an invisible spectre. And even today, in forgotten accounts, there is talk of a faceless soldier who defied death itself, a ghost, born of fire and lies, who will never be forgotten. And that was the story of the Ghost Woman of War, a secret buried in the mud of the trenches that survived only as a legend. But perhaps not everything died with her. They say Elisabeth had a son, a boy named Federico, a name that years later would echo not in the trenches, but in the nightmares of an entire generation. Federico Krüger. The next chapter goes beyond the official story. We will uncover how the true empire of smoke never ended. It just changed form. From cigarettes in the trenches, to vape vapor on the streets, from hookahs in taverns, to artificial flavors that seduce young people, the war is over, but the battle for the mind continues. Subscribe now, turn on the bell, because in the next video, the real story begins now.